Katie, I'll start with you, and hopefully we can kind of dive in and get a grasp around putting some context around civic problems, because that's a very, very broad place to go. So I'll let you to start us to give us some context. So from your relative perspectives as a researcher and entrepreneur and working inside of a city, what are good examples of entrepreneurs helping to solve civic problems? And in that, kind of give us a frame of mind of how you inside look at civic problems.
That's a good question. I mean, civic problems are all of our problems. And what's happening is the private sector is helping cities even identify problems. Under the current structure of cities, which we all deal with, it's usually through the RFP process. And in that process, there are a lot of assumptions made. Like, you know the problem, you likely know some of the answer, and then you just ask for someone to fill that hole. And things that when you start partnerships with entrepreneurs in earnest, it helps identify problems you really didn't even know that you had or you didn't understand correctly. And so there's a lot of advantage to doing that, and it's difficult, right? Because we cherish the values of an RFP, like fair competition, WIMBY requirements, and those are all very good. But how do we thread this needle so that we can get to problems quicker? If people can track their Uber, they're gonna wanna track their snowplows. And that's something that cities need to continue to catch up with. We read a book by Jeffrey West called Scale, and it talks about why things are the certain size that they are, and it says in the pattern of history, there's been innovation at no rate like before, and because of it, government has to be faster like ever before. And so it's critical that we work with entrepreneurs. The Innovation Advisory Council I mentioned focuses on 3 areas of homelessness, mobility, and delivery of basic services. The Innovation Partnership Program was a startup that came in and said, we've got something that can better the city, and we heard it, right? One of them was an app that could help first responders, I don't want to say perfect, but reduce errors when giving during CPR during a code blue. And they literally saved lives through this, and it's not something that the city was looking for, but it sure was a help, and now they're contracting with the biggest hospital system in Kansas City. So it is what we see, and it is what we don't see with entrepreneurs.
Luke, I'll jump to you, but Katie, I love the point you made about learning to think about problem solving differently and really taking a different approach to problem solving. What is that approach for you or for the spaces that you operate in? Kind of some of those like practical practices that you have for problem solving that could allow city officials to look at just the landscape differently, where they could find different nuances and problems that they didn't see existed.
I think the key thing is two things. One is a leader who supports it and cares and shows up and goes out to your city and empowers their staff. The second is a framework. The IPP really took off when we got the application system down. We narrowed down the pilot time, and same with the IAC, which is still moving. So I think the leadership and the framework are your 2 key things.
Solid. I would agree. Yeah. Leaders, which allow you to be vulnerable. Vulnerability, I have learned, is the greatest way to solve problems, to think of new problems. Luke, what is one thing that would afford easier collaboration between cities and local entrepreneurs and other innovative companies?
Yeah, maybe one of those ideas is building off a little bit of what Kate said around procurement. I think one of the challenges that cities sometimes face, or governments in general face, is the idea to solution hop. So you always say, this is the solution we want. We want it to be black, white, green, purple. We want it to be in size 12 font. Who can build it for us exactly like that? And that sometimes skips the what is the problem, what are the ways to solve it, and asks for the creative opportunities or a process that drives for user-centered ways of solving the problem, because it assumes that you already know what the solution is. So one of those is certainly rethink the way that you use procurement as a vehicle to ask for people to help solve those problems instead of just build the solution. I think one of the others is maybe just take the call. Being an entrepreneur and having been on the side of cold calling, dialing, walking up to a mayor at any number of events, the opportunities that I've seen produce the best results are when you simply answer the call. Whether it's a person that owns a storefront on the east side of the city, it's a tech entrepreneur, understanding what it is that they have and having them talk to the right person. And if that's the person that staffs the mayor's office and answers the phone call, get them in touch with someone like Kate, because they may not be the right time or at the right time to sell you something, but they're always at the right time to take your feedback. And so being able to give them actionable feedback that's based in policy, based in an understanding of government, is going to help them be more successful in the next call that they make or in the next way that they develop their solution. So I think those are two pretty actionable ways.
Solid.
Hey,
Great.
can
Thank you so
I
much.
hop in on that
Yeah,
too?
please.
Another thing, I love, Luke, how you talked about the procurement process. Kate, you talked about RFPs. I hate all of it. Here's the reality of it, right? So, I'm glad I'm in a room full of mayors because this is something that's been getting at me for a long time. All right. As a entrepreneur, I'll just be quite frank with you. I stopped responding to RFPs. In fact, to this day, if a company contacts me looking for an RFP, I just say, I don't do an RFP. That's not a part of my company's policy, but we do have a, basically where you can pay us to give you some free ideas, essentially. But notice that it's really not free when I said pay us. But with that being said, one thing that I think that's important that administration can do is consider a universal procurement. Here's the reality, right? Me being a black man with a business, Mayor Sly James talked about equity. I am so like on an equity train like for real. And the reality is this. When I just give you a real world example, I try to do actually one of the local governments, local departments contacted me and asked me if I wanted to submit to this RFP, and they really wanted to solicit my work because they felt that I understand the community and all this other stuff and blah, blah, blah. And long story short, when I got to talking to them about, what the expectation was, what the budget is, and all these just different things, they come back and they say, well, hey, are you a certified minority business? And I'm not. And they basically said, well, we strongly encourage you to be a minority certified business. I'm sorry, guys, that's a bunch of bullshit. Like, I shouldn't have to be a certified business, minority business, in order to do business with you. So with that being said, when we want to talk about procurement, we want to talk about RFPs, let's talk about universal procurement. If you really want to talk about merit and apples to apples, judge us on apples to apples, not because I am a minority business and I can help you get that government contract and all these other things. No, hire me because I can actually do the work. So I'm sorry about that. I just wanted to vent that real quick, mayors.
Yeah.
So
consider that.
So,
right?
so two quick things. Every single one of your procurements probably requires a business be in business for at least 5 years. That's bullshit too, right? The other thing is the average cost or the average investment that a company makes in responding, not including man hours, but the FedEx, the print, the color copies, is probably between $500 and $600 for every single procurement, regardless of whether it's $10 million or a $50,000 job. That's not equitable. So cities like KC have invested in online technology where every single RFP response is submitted electronically.
An IPP partner.
Yep. That's a great way to, again, just reduce those barriers.
Luke, I want to jump in right there around tech and around access to the internet, which still blows my mind that there are still homes in major metropolitan areas that do not have access to what I now believe is a basic human amenity at this point in the 21st century. How can entrepreneurs step into that space to help cities solve problems around getting access to homes that do not?
Yeah, so I think, again, identify the problem, ask people to bring the solution. When Google Fiber was first looking at Kansas City, a group of social entrepreneurs and nonprofits came together and said, how do we turn the city green? So they actually brought together the social media club, groups that had community organizing, and said, you know what? We're going to ask people to crowdfund the $10 to pay for Mr. Jones, who lives on the east side of Troost, to be able to get him a connection, right? He may not be able to do it. He may not have a debit card because Google Fiber required you have a debit card. again, not taking into consideration that barrier. So think about that human capital, those social kind of fabric that you have in your communities, and just ask people to say, hey, this is the problem. How do we solve the problem? You're typically going to find one. So that's I think, a great way. The other is think about the other pieces of technology and understand how users actually interact with technology. In some ways, the drive for 5G and small cell technology is certainly helping drive that. Most African American families with household incomes less than about $50,000 a year rely predominantly on their mobile device for access to the internet. So you need to think about that in terms of the investments you make in your own physical infrastructure. Broadband certainly will help, free ubiquitous Wi-Fi, 5G will help. But also think about what that means in terms of the way that you're building your city technology. The people that may rely on your government services the most or need to access those government services are the people riding the bus, pinching and zooming on their website, trying to figure out how to fill out a form for your government. So again, understand what those people are doing, what their needs are, and ask people to bring the solutions together to help solve those problems for you.
Yeah, I love it. Diving into equity. It was my favorite conversation. So let's jump to it, man. What are some of the biggest pitfalls that you feel like could be avoided when using big data or machine learning or analytics, or as we kind of take this holistic approach, what are some pitfalls that could be avoided when thinking about how to engage more vulnerable communities?
I don't think there's some pitfalls. I think there's honestly just one, and hands down is implicit bias. People have to recognize that when you're talking about things such as analyzing data, talking about machine learning algorithms, talking about artificial intelligence, any of these technologies that are becoming very dominant in our culture today, you have to recognize that the technology is nothing but a tool. We all know that, right? But it takes a human to actually develop that. And if you have a human that develops a photo image recognition AI, artificial intelligence, that classifies black people as gorillas, well, where does that come from? You see what I'm saying? So that comes from it's not even necessary saying that that developer was racist or anything of that intent, but they didn't have enough empathy to recognize their implicit bias to be able to look at the code or look at the data library and be able to recognize, oh, that is a silverback gorilla, not a person from Ghana. You see what I'm saying? So it's very important that, you know, again, for me, the most important major pitfall, if any, when you want to talk about tech development and things of that nature, is it comes back to the humans. Because at the end of the day, technology is just a tool, but it takes a person to develop it. And if we're not really focused and being intentional in building empathy in designers and developers and the business people that are trying to solve some of these problems, kind of getting back to Luke's point, empathy, understanding that people in certain communities may not have access to, you know, a broadband network, but maybe all they have is their cell phone, their Boost Mobile. Well, how do we empathize with that? So to me, everything comes back to the empathy piece, as well as, again, the pitfall will be implicit bias or unconscious bias. So.
Yeah. Katie, I would love for you to jump in here too, as I know it's kind of your sweet spot here with these, as you're building out the tech side and building tech as a more second nature for civic organizations. How does that play out for you?
Yeah, I get really nerdy really quickly on it, and I like Lewis's perspective a lot better. So Seattle has a surveillance ordinance. It's the first ordinance at a city level in the country. And it makes anything that can surveil or potentially damage civil liberties go through a very transparent process. And we're in the midst of that. So it's retroactive technologies as well. It's 28 technologies, and it includes our police department. There's some exceptions like body-worn cameras, things that watch infrastructure like bridges and dams. And then, of course, you know, California has some rights from the civil side. But the point is there are laws that aren't keeping up to what things can do, right? The laws tell you what you should do, and we're not keeping up with the ability of what technology can do. And so more than ever, we have to be extremely intentional with what technologies we're using and the capability of those technologies, because otherwise it's going to get really ahead of us, and these private sector companies are doing things that the government can't understand, and therefore we can't really regulate. And so we really need to be intentional on that. And the one thing that we are very emphasized in Seattle is there's no such thing as neutral for any technology that we put into the public ether, and that's really important.
Yeah, I love it. I would, if I could, I would like to, because I had the chance to visit with a few of the mayors here, and when I was asking them, getting their perspective on like civic problems, and a lot of them just really just summed it up to me as saying they're just trying to figure out how to be better problem solvers, how to, in ways where they're getting a lot thrown at them, and new technologies are coming out, and and there's demands all over the table. So walk me through maybe just your process of problem solving, and kind of how when you just have a world of things to figure out, how do you distill that down into ways that you can just kind of take a few actionable steps to try to get some things done where that practice might be adopted by people at the local level?
I think that at least my process of solving a problem, I think it applies to most people, is to look for, personally, I don't like looking for problems. I like looking for opportunities and solutions. And, there's not always a problem per se that can't be solved. It's just about changing the perspective. That to me is the beauty of entrepreneurship. You can be an entrepreneur and not necessarily own your own business. You don't need it, but you can have that thinking, and it's literally just looking at things from a different perspective. So to answer your question, Nico, how do I go about solving problems? I look at, well, where are the opportunities? So for example, again, my recent former past was a cross-cultural strategic branding consultant. That's a mouthful. But with that being said, oftentimes I would work with companies, usually C-level executives, and my whole positioning was to help companies, specifically engineering tech companies, understand how culture, in terms of global culture, can impact their business. So for example, if you're going to India and you want to set up an oil refinery, well, do you really understand the culture of that community so you can go in there with the right intent and know how to communicate and get business done? Well, oftentimes what would happen is, well, can you help us with diversity and recruit more diverse talent? I'm not a diversity practitioner, but I learned some things over a few years. With that being said, one of the things that I learned was that essentially a lot of companies were trying to solve this problem of diversity and inclusion, and they're doing things like unconscious bias training and all this other stuff, and it's honestly, most things are lip service, other things are Band-Aids to a bullet wound, and I saw an opportunity. And the opportunity was, well, how can we get to the core of a company and understand what types of implicit biases exist in their specific organization? So I developed a technology that analyzes performance reviews that looks for hidden bias within the organization. I was like, man, this is gonna be Kansas City's Amazon. I'm gonna do this, it's gonna blow up. And what I found out is that nobody really wanted to buy that technology because it scared a lot of people. So with that being said, thinking about how do you solve problems, thinking about the opportunity that's there, that was the opportunity I saw. Now, the entrepreneurial mindset, it didn't work, so I had to pivot it. But, it's looking with a fresh lens and being an outsider and trying to say, well, how can we do things differently at the end of the day?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Perspective is everything. One thing that I've kind of been taking in lately is asset-based community development, really looking that like there is value that already exists in these communities, instead of thinking about like how do we take some external value and put it in these communities to make them better, which I believe is an example of whitewashing something or believing that there is not inherent value in communities of color already. But I absolutely agree with you that perspective is huge.
So, we're in a really interesting industry. When Evan and I worked together and I taught him everything that he knows, it's true. When something didn't work, he was like, this is the right thing to do. I don't understand why we can't do this. And it was because of some political thing that was going on that it was impossible, right? People didn't like the change. We couldn't tell our story right. Something got muddled. And so, you know, I'm just staff, and I work for the fine people of mayors, but there are problems that sometimes just don't make sense. And so I think that's why really honing in on the data is one of the things I do every time. Checking out what other cities, my peers are doing is the second thing. And the third thing is just having the vigor and the wherewithal to keep going, right? I think some of the times it's hard to convince people that the right change is the right change. And so I just want to share my gratitude with this room for all of you who keep going and do those steps to solve our city's problems.
Thank you. I agree. Luke?
Yeah, I think the way that we always used to talk about it at Code for America is about user-centered policy, user-centered design. So, you know, if you think about a group of kind of concentric circles, if you put users at the center instead of policy at the center, you can start to drive for a lot better solution identification. Whether the user is, you know, a white tech guy, a black person on the east side of the city, a user sitting inside the administrative office in finance, a user sitting at the cashier window at the treasury, whatever it is, right? Everyone is a user in some way, and understanding what the actual problems are that they go through in a process ultimately can start to change how technology can solve it, but also how operations needs to change, and then can start to have better kind of impacts on policy, as compared to always saying, we're trying to fix this policy thing, and now how do we go and make it work for citizens or make it work for staff? Thinking about it from kind of the inverse is one of the great ways. I think a group that's done some really strong work around that is the city of Denver. It's called a program called Peak Academy. They now have a book out around peak performance. They consult with other cities that actually train staff in some of these principles of kind of Lean Six Sigma that comes back to, again, what's the solution or what's the problem, how do you identify the solution, and empower all of your staff to actually play an active role in solving those problems, because the problems aren't typically these big policy things that only policy wonks like Kate solve, but something that someone in the mailroom or in the cafeteria can also solve themselves.
Solid. I have a few more questions, but I also wanted to make sure we had time for the audience. So are we good? 10 minutes? Okay, cool. So communication, I think, is one big thing I want to touch on. Like, how do you all, I think cities have a way of historically communicating kind of in only one way to a certain group of people, and are now trying to find new ways to communicate to broader audiences, to all of their citizens. What approaches do you all take for your strategies around communication? Whether it be like really practical tools to communicate with constituents or consumers or whomever it may be, or more nuanced strategies for reaching broader audiences.
So I'll maybe start. So my company builds websites for governments all around the world. The first and most important thing you need to know, the average age of someone when they come to your website to read is 7th grade. Therefore, do not start, pursuant to Ordinance 654 in the cities of the blah, 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 and the bylaws of the state, in pursuant to the charter, right? Do you have a dog that needs a tag, yes or no, right? Think about how they communicate when they walk up to a window, and just communicate to them in plain language, but also just understand, you know, that they don't come at a postgraduate level. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think, think about what it is that someone needs at a specific point in time. So if someone's trying to understand the steps that they need to go through, think about that, your grandma's kitchen recipe. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Walk them through the process and just train them on the way that there's going to be consistency in how you do it. Because again, if you ground people in just that philosophical understanding of consistency and really plain language, it's going to make a lot of things a lot easier. So that's one really concrete way, I think.
Just to clarify, you're the seventh grade reading level?
7th grade reading level.
Okay, 7th grade reading level. I think you said 7th graders. So for something like
Oh, yeah.
7th grade reading
grader.
level. Gotcha. Yep. Okay.
No, I agree, because I build a lot of websites and user stuff, and I critique a lot of them as well. And hands down, government, local, state, federal, I don't know who does the websites, but it's terrible. Like it's the user experience, back to that point, is so bad. So with that being said, Luke is 1,000% right. Like, how can you make it easy, and then user-friendly. Going to, again, being able to pull out my phone and go to the website, and I'm not doing this, and I'm not scrolling over here and trying to click and type my name. And have you ever tried to get a permit from your city? Like, that is so hard to do on the phone. It's difficult. So
Something I learned from Kate, being involved in the IPP program, is, again, back to my idea of take the call, right? The more I sit down and talk to somebody who understands the policy, informs me, the more she hears from someone that understands the problem, informs her. Then when she goes and has a conversation with the council person or the city manager or the deputy city attorney, you're again communicating in just consistent ways that just promote understanding and understanding the actual problem. So I think that just helps people not, get lost in triangulation of, wait, is it trash or are they talking about waste services? It's trash, even though the city calls it waste services, right? Just normalize things internally and externally and talk to residents, because they'll just help you understand how they see it.
Yeah, I think, we are all city people here, but my favorite way to communicate is to let the, resident do it, like 311, I'm a huge fan. Any way that we can take data that doesn't have a filter from the city is pretty great, because we think that we're setting up the application right, and it's hard to understand, or it's hard for bias. I mean, we had a surveillance meeting for feedback on technologies that PD was using, and we had several uniformed officers show up, which is a tough thing to ask people to talk about their concerns for privacy when you have uniforms showing up. So how can we have this really real conversation that people who can come and feel comfortable coming in person, and you can empower your staff to talk to those people because you're one person? Or how do you find a way to get the data from them in a way that is genuine, I think is the best sort of communication that you can get to, especially to this equity lens of what people are thinking and what they know and what they don't know. We presume a lot, or we don't presume enough, so it's always a work in progress.
Solid, thank you. Yeah, I would love to take the opportunity to open it up to anyone. I mean, there were so many issues. I just kind of went around prior and was asking what issues were top of mind from people, and everything from infrastructure to education, affordable housing, poverty, economic growth, homelessness, safety. Those are a lot to unpack right now. We don't have that amount of time. But I would love if anyone within the vein that mentioned one of those would have a particular question that they would like to ask to our panelists.
Got a question. How you all?
good. How are
Thank
you?
Thanks for being
you.
here.
Thank you for your comments. I'm William Johnson. I'm the mayor of a small town in South Carolina. I also serve as the secretary of African American Mayors Association. But as we talk about entrepreneurs, it is my assumption, right, wrong, or indifferent, that usually small rural towns like Holly Hill, South Carolina, with 1,300 people, you may not be interested in them. Talk a little to that.
Yeah, so my good friend from Etsy is here, and I think many of you will have a chance to interact with her. You have entrepreneurs in garages, in basements. Etsy works with a global network of sellers who create homemade or handmade goods. Last year they had $5.7 billion in economic impact. 99% of all counties in the US have Etsy resellers. So they don't always look like high-tech, high-growth companies, but they are people that are contributing to your economy in really real ways, right? Some of them are hiring low-skilled, low-wage workers who want to go work in their garage sewing things, making things that still need access to jobs. So don't overlook the fact that entrepreneurs look a lot of different ways, and some of those entrepreneurs you may not be able to see because they may not be engaging with the city in business, or they may not be raising capital, but they're still showing up at the FedEx, they're still sending kids to school, and they're still contributing in some way. I think the data figure from Etsy is for every $1 that they sell, in most cases they're contributing $2.67 back to their communities. So there's real entrepreneurs in every single crevice of your city.
So how y'all doing? I just want to say to the Coffin Foundation, I am just so impressed and thankful to have a group of people that are just so smart. I love to speak to a group of elected officials, so it's great. So my question is in a city like where I'm from, and on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, their cultural competence is so important. And I think each one of you has spoke about cultural competence in so many different ways. You talked about it. You talked about development. You talked about understanding what you're dealing with. And I think my question is when we look at organizations in Mississippi, we all don't judge us. Mississippi is a great place, has a lot of opportunities, some good people there. And we look at cultural competence and we look at entrepreneurship. One thing that the Coffin Foundation inspired me to do last year was to go back to my community and say, how do we get people to understand what their community actually needs and what their community actually can do? How can you be an asset to your community? Everybody talk about the brain drain and young people leaving different states, but how do we figure out what people want to work in garages and things like that? So we started this small program. A church actually has some housing in the church. So a church gym, they created some apartments in this church, and we recruited students from colleges in Mississippi to come work and find out in our community what are areas that you can go to and develop a project. You have to be an entrepreneur, you have to start it from scratch. But our county government, our local elected officials, our boards, still have no idea about what they're doing. They don't support it. They're like, it's a waste. They don't value it. They don't understand the cultural awareness that these young people have. They just don't get it. You know, cultural competence is something that they're just lacking. And so we have to support ourselves, and we have to get money from places like the Coffin Foundation. But again, there's that long list of things that you have to do. There's that website that you have to go through to get permits. There's all the things that you guys have hit on are the barriers for people that are just trying to come and learn and be an asset to your community. And I think cultural awareness and competence for locally elected officials, especially those who've been elected for 20 years, is just a huge problem. So how do we be able to move forward and be helpful in those types of ways in local government? That was a nasty
Man,
question.
that was a long, I got you. Cultural competency is hands down. I mean, when you want to talk about the diversity and inclusion and all that stuff, those are bricks, and cultural competency is essentially the foundation that supports all of that. So how do you teach people how to become more culturally competent? Well, honestly, man, if I just had to be frank, people have to want to learn at the end of the day. If they're not willing to open themselves up and try to learn about another culture, try to understand, again, just being empathetic towards someone else, then that's just going to be a hard barrier to cross. Now, here's some tactical things that potentially can be done. Imagine taking somewhat of a ethnographic approach by documenting some of these things that are taking place. These different young people that are coming in that either have a different perspective on how they're thinking, document it. Because most people learn better visually when they see something, right? So if you were to document what's going on, and if you were to show the different ways that people are bringing entrepreneurial thinking to your community, and then show your officials or whoever, potentially that may trigger something for them. But with that being said, I'm a firm believer that people have to be willing to open themselves up and want to learn how to be more culturally competent. Otherwise, you're talking to a dead horse at that point.
Oh, I was gonna say, if I could add to that, which is great. I mean, what we've been talking about interaction with cities and entrepreneurs in a vendor relationship, right? And you're talking about how do you support entrepreneurs that the city doesn't have business with, which I think is equally, if not more important, of a like culture to create. And just showing that your city is wanting to support that community and to listen to their needs, lower barriers, whatever business license they need, educate what it takes to start up a business, make it less scary is awesome. So the fact that you're putting yourself out there is starting the conversation already.
One nuance that I caught when he was speaking was this idea that entrepreneurs have about pivoting, and it's varied in conversation and when it's important how you do it. But nonetheless, I think it's a critical skill that the entrepreneur is never so married to an idea that they aren't afraid to pivot and try something new. And so, what would be your experiences or perspectives on how to utilize that skill in a more foundational infrastructure like a city that's harder to pivot, but that skill set of being able to navigate through challenges and try different approaches is critical for success?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways that's where like Peak Academy as a program that came out of the city of Denver really helps people think about kind of agile, iterative steps to solving problems. So you don't go solve, and then you realize you've actually solved for the wrong problem. So that's one way of just getting people, again, back to Kate's earlier point, in a framework that trains them how to take step-by-step processes is one piece. I think one of the other things, just on the entrepreneurial side of it, any entrepreneur, if you are their first contract, they are going to bust their ass for you more than they are their 267th client. So if you want to really help someone and train them, right, think about just figure out the way to get them in, pull them in, incubate them, mentor them, because they're going to bust their ass to make it as successful as they possibly can, because you're their trackway for scale.
I think that's a great place. I'm going to jump in right now, Nico, because there's food ready. I'm getting the high
Here all night. Look, what's on?
But can I get a round of applause for this amazing panel? Thank you so much.